A mistaken proposal to the alien queen, but she accepted it. Queen Sareth Ivan had not left the medical wing in 3 days. Her advisors begged her to rest, to eat, to attend to the affairs of state that piled higher with each passing hour. She refused them all. Minjun lay on a bed designed for Velkari bodies, surrounded by machines that hummed with technologies far beyond anything human. Science had achieved, but none of it was working. His physiology rejects our treatments, the chief medical officer explained with patterns of frustration and sorrow. Every time we repair the damage, his body fights against our methods, and we cannot find a way to make him accept our help. Sareth Ivan stood at the window of the medical chamber and stared out at her empire of crystal and light. She had ruled this vast civilization. For 200 cycles, she had commanded fleets that could shatter worlds and diplomats who could reshape the fates of entire species, but she could not save one small human who had thrown himself between her and death without hesitation. There must be something, she said in a voice that had gone hollow and strange. I will give anything, do anything, sacrifice anything to keep him alive. The medical officer's patterns flickered with hesitation before he spoke again. There is one possibility, but it has never been attempted before. He explained that Velkari regenerative technology could theoretically be combined with human stem cell treatments, forcing human cells to accept Velkari healing methods by blending them together at the most basic level. The risks were enormous. Minjun might die from the procedure itself, or he might survive but be changed in ways that no one could predict. Do it, Sareth Ivan commanded without hesitation. My queen, the human diplomatic team must be consulted before. I said do it, she repeated with royal authority that shook the walls. And if anyone tries to stop you, I will have them removed from my empire permanently. Ambassador Jihei arrived minutes later with Dr. Park Sujin, the human delegation's medical officer, and together they reviewed the proposed treatment. This is insane, Sujin said while studying the Velkari medical data. We have no idea what this will do to him. He will die if we do nothing, Jihei replied with exhaustion heavy in her voice. At least this gives him a chance. Sujin looked at the queen, whose patterns had dimmed to colors of desperate hope, and made her decision. I will need access to all of your regenerative technology, she said to the Velkari medical team. And someone needs to explain to me exactly how your healing methods work. The procedure took 17 hours. Sujin and the Velkari doctors worked together in ways that neither species had ever imagined possible, combining techniques from opposite ends of the galaxy in a desperate attempt to save one human life. Sarathan waited outside the surgical chamber, with her patterns cycling through fear and hope and something that might have been prayer if the Velkari had believed in such things. Finally, the doors opened and Sujin emerged with exhaustion written across every line of her face. He is alive, she said, and the queen's patterns exploded with relief, so bright that it lit the entire corridor. But Sujin held up her hand before Sareth Ivan could rush past her into the chamber. He's changed, she warned. The procedure worked, but it left marks that will never fade. Minjun lay on the medical bed with his eyes closed and his breathing steady for the first time in days, but his skin was different, now faint. Bioluminescent patterns traced across his body like rivers of soft light, permanently embedded by the Velkari technology that had saved his life. He was no longer fully human, and he was certainly not Velkari, with something new. A bridge between two worlds that had never been connected before. When he opened his eyes and saw Sareth Ivan standing beside him, his new patterns flickered with colors that she recognized immediately, hope and relief, and something warm that needed no translation. You stayed, he said, with a voice rough from disuse. Of course I stayed, she replied while taking his hand in hers. Did you think I would abandon you after you nearly died protecting me?" He looked down at his glowing skin and laughed. And the sound was still human, despite everything. "I guess this means I really cannot back out of the ceremony now," he said with a weak smile. Sarathan made her own attempt at laughter, and the terrible sound made them both smile even wider. The bonding ceremony took place 1 week later in the ancient temple under 3 pale suns. Every noble in the Valkyrie court attended, along with representatives from dozens of species across the galaxy. Ambassador Jihai stood with the human delegation, watching with something that might have been pride as one of her officers prepared to make history. Minjin walked down the aisle of the temple, with his new patterns glowing softly against his dark formal attire. He had practiced the ritual words until he knew them not just in translation, but in their true meaning. Understanding the weight of every syllable, Sarathani waited for him at the altar, radiant in ceremonial robes that shifted through every color of joy and anticipation. When Minjin spoke the words of bonding, his patterns flared in sync with hers. 2 very different beings glowing together in perfect harmony. "I bind myself to you," he said in the Valkyrie tongue. "Across the distance between stars, across the difference between worlds, I choose you." Sarathivan responded with words of her own, ancient phrases that had been spoken for thousands of cycles by Valkyrie royalty. But then she added something new. She laughed. The sound was still terrible, still like breaking glass and startled birds. But this time, the entire court laughed with her because they had learned from the small human who had become one of them. They had learned that connection could come from the strangest places. They had learned that love did not care about logic or reason, or the vast emptiness between species, and they had learned that sometimes the best alliances began with the worst mistakes. After the ceremony, Minjin stood with his bondmate on a balcony overlooking the Crystal City, watching the 3 suns set in a blaze of colors that reminded him of home. "I have a question," he said while leaning against her side. "Ask." She replied with patterns of contentment. "When you accepted my proposal in the throne room, what color did you glow?" Sarathivan was quiet for a moment before answering. "It has no name in any language," she admitted. "A color that no Valkyrie had ever produced before, because no Valkyrie had ever felt what I felt in that moment." Minjun watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold. "Then I will give it a name," he said. He thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The mistake and the fear and the loneliness and the strange, impossible connection that had grown between them. "Hope," he said finally. "I will call that color hope." Sarathivan's patterns shifted into the very color he had named, and she held him close as the suns disappeared below the horizons. Somewhere far away, Ambassador Jihei sent her final report to Earth Command. The mission was a complete success. She wrote, "We've secured not just mining rights, but something far more valuable. Proof that the galaxy's strangest alliances begin with the strangest mistakes, and that humans will always find a way to turn disaster into triumph." She paused before adding one final line. "Sometimes we just need someone brave enough to reach across the void." Minjun spent 3 days trying to decide what to do with the information about the assassination plot. He could tell Ambassador Jihei and let the diplomatic corps handle it through proper channels. But that would mean trusting Valkyrie security forces that might include the very conspirators he was trying to stop. He could warn the Queen directly, but he had no proof and no names. Nothing except an anonymous message that could have been sent by anyone. For any reason, in the end he chose a third path. He would stay close to Sarath Ivan and watch for any sign of danger with his own eyes. The pre-bonding celebration was scheduled to take place in the Great Crystal Hall where they had first met, and the entire Valkyrie court would be present, Along with representatives from a dozen allied species, security would be tight. But Minjun had learned enough about Velkari technology to know that their light-bending cloaking devices could render assassins completely invisible to both eyes and sensors. He arrived at the celebration wearing formal attire that the Queen had provided for him. Dark fabric woven with threads that glowed faintly in patterns meant to honor humanity. Sarthivan stood at the center of the hall receiving guests. And when she saw him approach, her patterns brightened into colors of genuine pleasure. "You look almost Velkari tonight," she said with warmth in her voice. "Except for your unfortunate lack of height. I will try to grow taller before the ceremony." Minjun replied with a smile that felt natural for the first time since this strange journey had begun. They stood together as the celebration continued around them. And Minjun watched every shadow and every guest with attention that bordered on obsession. He saw High Commander Erelthax standing with a group of military officers whose patterns flickered with suppressed tension. He saw servants moving through the crowd with drinks and food, any one of whom could be hiding weapons beneath their ceremonial robes. He saw representatives from alien species watching the proceedings with expressions that ranged from curious to calculating to openly hostile. And then he saw something that made his heart stop. 3 servants were moving toward the Queen's position, but something was wrong with the way they walked. Too smooth and too coordinated, like predators stalking prey. Their patterns were muted and controlled in a way that seemed unnatural. And Minjun suddenly understood what he was seeing. Light-bending technology did not make someone completely invisible. It simply bent light around them to create the illusion of empty space. But it could not perfectly replicate the bioluminescent patterns of real Velkari servants. And these 3 were glowing just slightly wrong. Minjun moved without thinking. He threw himself between Sarathivan and the approaching figures just as the illusion dropped and revealed 3 Velkari warriors in combat, armor with crystal blades drawn. The first blade was meant for the Queen's heart. Instead, it buried itself in Minjun's shoulder. Pain exploded through his body like lightning made solid, but he did not fall. Grabbing the assassin's arm and refusing to let go even as blood poured from his wound. "Run!" he screamed at Sarathivan while the other 2 assassins circled toward them. "Get out of here now!" But she did not run. She stood frozen for one terrible moment, watching this small human bleed for her with patterns of shock and something else that burned like white fire. Then Minjun did something that every species in the galaxy had heard about, but few had ever witnessed. He fought back. He was injured and unarmed and facing 3 trained Velkari warriors who stood twice his height and carried weapons designed to cut through crystal. But he was human. He was a deathworlder from a planet that wanted to kill its inhabitants every single day, and he was not going to let them touch her. Minjun released his grip on the first assassin and dropped low, dodging a blade strike that should have taken his head from his shoulders. He grabbed a ceremonial pole from a nearby display and swung it with all the strength his wounded body could muster, catching the second assassin across the knees. The warrior fell and Minjun was on top of him in an instant, driving the pole into the gap between armor plates with savage precision. The third assassin grabbed him from behind and threw him across the hall. Like a discarded toy, Minjun hit the crystal floor hard enough to crack it, and he tasted blood as he struggled to rise on limbs that refused to obey his commands. But still he did not stop. He crawled toward the Queen on hands and knees, placing himself between her and the remaining attackers. A broken human barrier that refused to fall. "You will not touch her," he said, through blood and pain. "I will not allow it." The assassins stared at him with patterns of disbelief, unable to comprehend this creature that kept fighting when any rational being would have surrendered. And then Sarath did something that shocked everyone. In that great crystal hall, her patterns exploded into light so bright that half the court was instantly blinded power that she had kept hidden all her life. Abilities reserved for Valkyrie royalty in times of existential threat erupted from her body in waves that shattered the assassins where they stood. When the light faded, 3 attackers were nothing but ash on the crystal floor. Guards rushed forward to secure the scene, and High Commander Erelthax tried to slip away through the chaos, but found himself surrounded by loyal officers who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Evidence would later connect him to the assassination plot beyond any doubt. But Minjun saw none of this. He lay on the cracked crystal floor with his life pouring out of the wound in his shoulder, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Sarath kneeling beside him with patterns that blazed with terror and something that might have been love. "Stay with me," she begged, in a voice that had lost all royal composure. "Please, you stubborn, impossible human. Do not leave me now." He wanted to tell her that he was not going anywhere. He wanted to tell her about the sunset and the laughter, and all the things they had not yet shared, but the darkness was stronger than his will, and it pulled him down into silence. When the medical teams arrived, they found the Queen of the Valkyrie Empire cradling a dying human in her arms, her patterns screaming grief in colors that no one present had ever seen before. They tried to save him with Valkyrie medicine, but his physiology was too different. Too alien, too human, and as the night stretched toward dawn, it seemed that the bond between them would end before it truly began. Minjun made his decision the morning after his conversation with the Queen in the Garden of Singing Lights. He found Ambassador Jihei in her quarters reviewing communication logs from Earth Command, and she looked up at him with eyes that carried the weight of sleepless nights. "I am going to stay," he told her before she could speak. "I am going to learn about the Valkyrie before I make any final decisions." Jihei studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "The Queen has offered to show you her world," she said while pulling up a schedule on her display. "Tours of temples and markets and historical archives, all designed to help you understand her people. And you approve of this?" Minjun asked with genuine surprise. "I approve of gathering intelligence," Jihei replied with the hint of a smile. "Whatever else happens, learning about the Valkyrie can only benefit humanity in the long term." And so began the strangest education that any human had ever received. The Queen herself served as his guide through the wonders of her empire. And Minjun discovered very quickly that everything he thought he knew about the Valkyrie was incomplete. They were not cold as the galactic rumors suggested. They simply expressed warmth in ways that human senses could not naturally perceive. On the 3rd day of his education, the Queen presented him with a small device that attached to his temple and translated Valkyrie bioluminescence into visual patterns he could understand. "This will let you see what we feel," Sarath explained while helping him adjust the device. "Our patterns carry emotional depth that your species cannot perceive without assistance." She was right. With the translator active, Minjun could finally see the truth that had been invisible to him since his arrival. The Valkyrie were not emotionless beings of pure logic. They burned with feelings so intense that they made human emotions seem pale and simple by comparison. And when Sarath looked at him, her patterns glowed with colors that his new device labeled as hope and curiosity, and something warm that had no direct translation in return for her lessons Minjun taught her about humanity. He showed her music first, playing recordings from his personal collection that spanned centuries of human creativity. The Queen sat motionless as she listened to symphony, orchestras, and solo piano pieces and ancient folk songs from every corner of Earth. "This is impossible," she said after the final. Notes of a violin concerto faded into silence. How can vibrations in air carry such meaning? Such emotion. We call it art, Minjun explained with a smile. Humans have always found ways to put feelings into forms that can be shared. The Valkyrie had nothing equivalent to music in their culture. They communicated through light and gesture and precise language. But the idea of creating beauty purely for the sake of emotional expression was entirely foreign to them. Sarath listened to every recording he possessed, sometimes playing the same piece dozens of times while her patterns shifted through colors of wonder and confusion and joy. Then he showed her a sunset from Earth, projected in hologram across the walls of her private chambers. The Queen watched the sky change from blue to orange to purple to black, and her patterns glowed so bright that the room seemed filled with a second sun. You have seen this? She asked with something like reverence in her voice. With your own eyes you have witnessed such beauty. Many times, Minjun replied while watching her watch the recording. Every evening on Earth, the sky paints itself in new colors. She made him play the recording 17 times before she was willing to let him show her anything else. When he explained the concept of laughter, she insisted on attempting it herself. And the sound she produced was so strange and unexpected that her guards rushed into the room with weapons drawn. They found their queen making noises that sounded like breaking glass mixed with startled birds, and they stared at her with patterns of pure confusion. Minjal laughed at their expressions, and Sarath tried to copy the sound, and the result was even worse than before. But somehow that terrible noise became the first thing they truly shared, a joke that belonged only to the two of them. Word of the upcoming bonding ceremony spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Some species sent messages of congratulations that seemed genuine, while others sent warnings that were barely disguised as diplomatic concerns. The Valkyrie court itself was divided in its response to the situation. Many nobles seemed genuinely pleased that their queen had found a bondmate, but others watched Minjun with patterns that his translator labeled as suspicion and contempt. High Commander Rilthax was the most open in his opposition. He was a towering Valkyrie warrior whose patterns never showed anything except cold disdain whenever he looked at the human who had stumbled into a place. At his queen's side, the Deathworlder does not belong here. Minjun overheard him saying to other nobles during a formal dinner, he is a primitive from a primitive world, and his presence insults everything our empire represents. Sarath heard it too, and her patterns flared with dangerous colors that made everyone in the room fall silent. Lieutenant Kang is my chosen bondmate, she said in a voice that carried royal authority. Any insult to him is an insult to me, and I will respond accordingly. Aralthax bowed his head in submission, but his patterns told a different story, one of resentment and barely contained rage. That night, Minjun found a message waiting for him when he returned to his quarters. The words were in Valkyrie script, but his translator converted them easily enough. You have been warned. The message read, leave before the ceremony or face the consequences. Minjun deleted the message without telling anyone about it. He was not afraid of threats from jealous nobles, and he was not going to run away from something that he was only beginning to understand, because somewhere in the past weeks of learning and laughing and watching sunsets together, something had changed inside him. He no longer saw Sarath as an alien queen who had trapped him in an impossible situation. He saw her as someone remarkable, someone lonely, someone reaching across the void between stars in hope of finding connection, and he was not sure he wanted to find a way out anymore. But late that night another message arrived, and this one made his blood run cold. Assassins have been hired. The anonymous warning read, the target is not you, human, but the queen herself. Because if she dies before the bonding, then the alliance dies with her. Minjun sat in the darkness of his quarters and realized that everything had just become far more dangerous than he could have imagined. 3 days had passed since the disaster in the throne room, and Minjun had not slept for more than a few hours at a time since that terrible moment when his fingers had betrayed him. The human delegation had been moved to quarters that were clearly designed for honored guests, with walls that sang gentle melodies and floors that warmed themselves to match human body temperature. But luxury meant nothing when the weight of an entire species rested on shoulders that had never asked to carry such a burden. Jihei had spent every waking hour in communication with Earth Command, and the news she brought back was never good. They are simultaneously furious and fascinated, she reported during one of their emergency meetings. Half of the diplomatic corps wants to court-martial you, and the other half wants to give you a medal for accidentally securing the most important alliance in human history. I do not want a medal, Minjun said with exhaustion heavy in his voice. I want someone to tell me how to fix this without starting an interstellar war. Their legal experts had combed through every piece of galactic law they could access, and every path led to the same conclusion. The Valkyrie bonding ritual was considered sacred across vast portions of known space, and breaking it would mark humanity as oath-breakers in the eyes of dozens of species. On the morning of the 4th day, a Valkyrie official arrived with a message that made Minjun's stomach twist into knots. Queen Sarath Ivan had requested a private audience with her betrothed in the royal gardens, and refusing such a request was apparently not an option that existed in Valkyrie culture. Minjun walked through corridors of singing crystal toward a destination he dreaded with every fiber of his being, expecting cold formality or perhaps thinly veiled hostility from a queen who had been tricked by a clumsy human. The royal gardens were nothing like any garden Minjun had ever seen on Earth. They existed within a massive biodome filled with plants that glowed with their own inner light, creating a forest of luminescence that shifted and pulsed like a living aurora. And there at the center of it all stood Queen Sarath Ivan, her tall form radiating soft silver light as she examined a flower that sang in frequencies just below human hearing. She turned as he approached, and her pattern shifted into colors that his translation device identified as cautious welcome, Lieutenant Kang Minjun. She said his name with careful precision that suggested she had practiced its pronunciation. Thank you for accepting my invitation. I did not think I had much choice in the matter. Minjun replied with honesty that probably violated every diplomatic protocol ever written. To his surprise, the queen made a sound that his device could not translate. Something between a hum and a whisper that might have been amusement. You speak directly, she observed. This is a quality I have read about in human cultural databases, but experiencing it is quite different from reading about it. She gestured for him to walk beside her through the glowing forest, and he fell into step with her despite every instinct telling him to run in the opposite direction. I must ask you something, Minjun said after they had walked in silence for several minutes. And I need you to answer me honestly. Valkyrie do not lie, she replied with what might have been pride or simple statement of fact. It is biologically impossible for us to speak untruths without our patterns revealing the deception. Then tell me this, he said, while stopping to face her directly. Did you know that I made a mistake when I performed that gesture? The queen was silent for a long moment, and her patterns shifted through colors that his device labeled as complex emotional processing. Yes, she finally admitted. I knew. Minjun felt something crack inside his chest. Some small hope that this had all been a genuine misunderstanding that could be gently corrected. Then why? He demanded with frustration bleeding into his voice. Why would you accept a proposal that you knew was an accident? Sarath Ivan turned away from him and looked out across her garden of singing lights. And for the first time since he had met her, She seemed almost vulnerable. "My empire is fracturing," she said quietly. "There are factions within my court who believe that I am not fit to rule, and they grow bolder with each passing cycle." She turned back to face him with patterns that pulsed with something his device called desperate hope. "The humans are whispered about across every corner of the galaxy." She continued, "Your species is called unpredictable and resilient and terrifying in ways that older races cannot comprehend. And an alliance with you would make my enemies hesitate before moving against me." Minjun wanted to be angry at her for using his mistake as a political tool, but the raw honesty in her voice made anger impossible. "So this is just politics," he said with disappointment that surprised him. "Just a convenient arrangement to strengthen your position." The Queen's patterns flared with colors that his device struggled to name, shifting through spectrums that no human eye was designed to see. "No," she said with intensity that made the garden around them pulse in response. "That is not the complete truth." She moved closer to him, and he could feel the warmth radiating from her luminescent skin like standing near a gentle fire. "I have studied your species for many cycles," she admitted with patterns that his device labeled as embarrassment. "Your art and your music and your strange emotional bonds fascinate me in ways I cannot fully express in any language." She reached out with one long, graceful hand and touched the air near his face without quite making contact. "When I saw you standing there in my throne room, making your clumsy mistake with your small, brave hands, I felt something that I have never felt before." Minjun stared up at her ancient star-deep eyes and saw something there that he recognized despite the vast gulf between their species: loneliness. Deep and endless and carefully hidden from everyone around her. "I am utterly alone," Sarathivan said, as if reading his thoughts. "I have been alone since I took this throne, surrounded by subjects and servants, but truly known by no one." She withdrew her hand, and her patterns dimmed to something soft and sad. "The bonding ceremony must occur within 30 planetary rotations, according to our law," she said while turning away from him. "If you wish to find a way out of this arrangement, I will not stop you." She began to walk deeper into her garden of lights, but paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. "But ask only this," she said with a voice that carried hope and fear in equal measure. "Before you decide, take time to understand my people, and perhaps to understand me." Then she was gone, disappeared into the glowing forest like a ghost made of starlight and sorrow. Minjun stood alone among the singing flowers and realized that everything he thought he knew about this situation had just become far more complicated. The Queen was not his captor or his enemy. She was someone reaching across the vast emptiness of space, hoping to find connection in the most unlikely of places, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do about that. Ambassador Yoon Ji-hae had spent 15 years preparing for moments like this one, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the crystalline throne world of the Velkari Empire. The shuttle descended through clouds that sparkled like crushed diamonds, and below them stretched a city that seemed grown rather than built, with towers of living crystal reaching toward 3 pale suns that hung in the violet sky. "Remember everything we discussed," Ji-hae said to her small delegation as they prepared to disembark. "The Valkyrie are literal in all things, so choose your words carefully and let me do most of the talking." Lieutenant Kam Minjun nodded from his seat beside her, reviewing the gesture protocols on his tablet one final time, and he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical thing. He was the cultural advisor for this mission, handpicked because of his expertise in xenolinguistics and nonverbal alien communication. And he had studied the Valkyrie for 3 years straight without rest. The Valkyrie were unlike any species humanity had encountered before, standing nearly 3 meters tall with bodies that seemed carved from moonlight and pearl. And they communicated through a complex system that combined spoken words with bioluminescent patterns and ritualized gestures. Getting any part of the communication wrong could mean disaster. And Minjun knew that every movement of his hands would carry meaning whether he intended it or not. The shuttle touched down on a landing platform that chimed with musical tones under their weight. And waiting for them stood a delegation of Velkari, officials whose skin pulsed with soft blue light. Jihei stepped forward first as protocol demanded, and Minjun followed 2 steps behind her with the rest of the team arranged in careful formation. The walk to the throne room took nearly an hour, through corridors that sang with harmonic frequencies and chambers filled with floating lights that seemed alive and curious about the strange visitors. Minjun had never felt so small in his entire life, surrounded by architecture that made human achievements look like children playing with blocks. But he kept his face neutral and his breathing steady. Finally, they reached the throne room, and nothing he had studied could have prepared him for what he saw there. Queen Sarathivan sat upon a throne that grew from the floor, like a frozen explosion of light. And she was the most beautiful and terrifying being Minjun had ever witnessed, with eyes that held the depth of ancient stars. Her skin shifted through colors that had no names in any human language. And when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made his chest vibrate with strange emotions. "Humans of Earth," she said in perfectly accented English that she had clearly learned just for this occasion. "You honor the Velkari with your presence in our realm." Jihei bowed in the human fashion and then performed the Velkari gesture of respectful greeting that they had practiced hundreds of times before departure. "Great Queen of the Velkari." Jihei replied with careful precision, "We come seeking friendship and mutual benefit between our peoples." The court watched in absolute silence as the formal exchange continued through its prescribed phases. And Minjun counted the gestures internally while preparing for his own role in the ceremony. His part would come next. The gesture of eternal friendship between peoples that would seal the opening of negotiations. And he had practiced the hand movements until he could perform them in his sleep. Jihei turned to him and nodded, signaling that his moment had arrived. And Minjun stepped forward with his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged animal. He raised his hands to begin the gesture sequence, and something went wrong in that terrible instant. Perhaps it was the stress of standing before an alien queen in a palace of singing crystal. Or perhaps his fingers simply betrayed him at the worst possible moment. But the gesture he performed was not the one he had practiced. The difference was subtle. Merely the positioning of his smallest finger and the angle of his wrist. But in Velkari culture, such small differences carried enormous meaning. He had meant to offer eternal friendship between peoples. Instead, he had performed the ancient proposal of royal bonding, essentially asking the queen to become his life mate in front of her entire court. The throne room fell into a silence so complete that Minjun could hear his own blood rushing through his veins. And every Velkari present had frozen in place. Like statues carved from living light, Queen Sarathivan stared at him with those ancient star-deep eyes. And her bioluminescent patterns shifted through colors that moved too fast for him to interpret, seconds stretched into eternities as Minjun stood there with his hands still raised and his mind screaming at him that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Then the queen did something that no one in that throne room expected. Her pattern settled into a configuration that pulsed with warm golden light, and she rose from her throne with fluid grace that made her seem to float rather than walk. "I accept," she said, in a voice that rang through the crystal chamber. Like a bell announcing the dawn of a new age, the court erupted into activity as Velkari officials rushed forward with expressions that might have been joy or shock or some alien emotion that humans could not comprehend. Minjun felt hands guiding him and his delegation toward a side chamber, while voices spoke in rapid Velkari that his translator struggled to process. What just happened? Jihei demanded once they were alone, her diplomatic composure cracking for the first time since Minjin had known her. Why are they acting like we just won a war? Their translation AI unit flickered to life with a non-apologetic tone the machine should not have been capable of producing. I regret to inform you that Lieutenant Kang performed a Valkyrie ritual of royal bonding proposal, the AI explained. The Queen has formally accepted, which means that Lieutenant Kang is now betrothed to the sovereign ruler of the Valkyrie Empire. The room went silent as the human delegation processed this information with varying degrees of horror spreading across their faces. That cannot be right, Minjun said with a voice that had gone hollow and strange. I practiced that gesture 1,000 times, and I know I performed it correctly. The gesture you performed differed from the friendship gesture by exactly 3 millimeters of finger placement. The AI continued without mercy. In Valkyrie culture, this transforms the meaning entirely, and the Queen's acceptance is now legally binding across 17 star systems. Jihei grabbed Minjun by the shoulders and stared into his eyes with an intensity that made him want to disappear into the floor. Tell me there is a way to fix this, she said through clenched teeth. Tell me we can apologize and explain that it was a mistake. I was quiet for a moment before delivering the final blow to any hope they might have held. Refusing a royal bonding acceptance is considered the highest possible insult in Valkyrie culture, it said. Historical records indicate that the last species to refuse such an acceptance was subjected to 300 years of war that ended with their complete extinction. Minjun stared at Jihei as the full weight of what he had done came crashing down upon him like a collapsing star. He was now betrothed to an alien queen, and backing out could doom humanity's entire future among the stars somewhere. In the distance, the Crystal Palace sang with celebration, completely unaware that the groom wanted nothing more than to wake up from this impossible nightmare.